12 Hollywood stars who hid their black heritage, shocking revelations. What if the Hollywood star you've known for years was never fully allowed to be seen, not because they lied, but because the industry edited the story? Tonight, we're exposing 12 cases where heritage was blurred, softened, or treated as too complicated for the spotlight. From old-school passing to modern ethnic ambiguity, these aren't gossip twists. They're survival strategies inside a system built on marketable images. Stay to the end, because one name will flip the way you think about casting colorism and who gets to be called universal. For fact-first breakdowns with real context, subscribe to the Black Excellence List now. Merle Oberon. Merle Oberon built a screen persona that looked tailor-made for classic Hollywood luminous complexion, a refined accent, and the kind of romantic elegance studios loved to export worldwide. When audiences watched her as Kathy in Wuthering Heights, 1939, they weren't just seeing a talented leading lady, they were seeing an identity Hollywood could sell without complications. But behind the publicity stills was a truth that the industry of the 1930s and 40s treated like a career-ending risk. Oberon was born in Bombay, now Mumbai, in 1911, and biographical research describes her as Anglo-Indian with family roots connected to Sri Lanka's Burgher community. In that era, studios didn't merely market stars, they manufactured acceptable origins. Oberon's public backstory was repeatedly reshaped to sound safely European, including claims that she was born in Tasmania and raised by white parents, while details about her mother and early life were blurred or withheld. This wasn't about vanity in the modern sense. It was strategy because one persistent rumor about non-white ancestry could limit roles endorsements, even social access inside Hollywood's inner circles. If the industry made your ancestry a liability, would you risk everything to correct the record? That question sits at the center of Oberon's story. The pressure to pass didn't only shape press releases, it shaped behavior. Accounts describe her as guarded about childhood memories and reluctant to give reporters clean threads to pull. And the toll wasn't abstract modern retrospectives. Note how intense the period's beauty standards were, with performers pushed toward harsh makeup routines and skin-lightening practices that could damage skin over time, an added layer to the physical and emotional cost of maintaining the studio-approved image. What makes her legacy especially striking is that she achieved historic milestones while living inside that concealment. She received an Academy Award nomination for The Dark Angel, 1935, and later generations have discussed her as the first Asian-descended Best Actress nominee. Yet she could not publicly claim that identity without risking the very career the nomination celebrated. Only after her death did the fuller picture become widely discussed, reframing her not as someone ashamed, but as someone navigating a system that punished complexity. Merle Oberon didn't simply play a role on screen, she was forced to perform an edited version of herself off-screen too. Rashida Jones. Rashida Jones is one of those Hollywood names people think they know. She was born in 1976 to Quincy Jones, a black music giant, and Peggy Lipton, a white actress, which placed her at the center of America's mixed-race reality long before it became a mainstream conversation. But on screen, whether audiences met her through The Office or Parks and Recreation, many viewers didn't immediately read her as black because Hollywood tends to assign identity through quick visual shortcuts, not family history. That misread isn't just a social quirk, it can shape casting publicity and the way an actor's story is told or quietly skipped. What makes Rashida's case fit your theme is that the industry didn't need her to deny anything, it simply learned how to not mention it. She has spoken about how Hollywood handlers and casting gatekeepers struggled to place her neatly, and how she was told she wasn't enough of one thing or was too much of another, proof that ambiguity can be its own kind of pressure. And then there's the moment that exposes how quickly heritage becomes political when other people decide it should. In 1993, rapper Tupac Shakur criticized Quincy Jones for having children with a white woman, and a 17-year-old Rashida fired back with a furious letter defending her family, an early public collision between her private identity and the way the world wanted to label it. If people keep misreading someone's race, is that invisibility harmless, or does it quietly rewrite opportunity? That question is the heartbeat of her story. Rashida's career became a case study in how heritage can be overlooked or downplayed without anyone saying hide it. Her roles often weren't written with racial framing, which helped her move through mainstream comedy as a universal presence, while her black lineage sat right there, rarely foregrounded in the marketing. It's a modern twist on an old Hollywood pattern. The system doesn't always erase identity with force. Sometimes it simply edits it out through omission until the audience forgets to ask what story is standing just outside the frame. Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle's heritage wasn't a mystery to her. It was a reality she grew up negotiating long before royal headlines ever arrived. She was born in 1981 to a black mother, Doria Ragland, and a white father, Thomas Markle, and she has consistently described herself as biracial. But in Hollywood, heritage doesn't always read the way a resume reads. The industry often decides identity by first glance, then builds a public narrative around whatever looks easiest to market. Meghan has spoken directly about that pressure. She wrote that she kept getting turned away for roles because she wasn't seen as black enough for black parts or white enough for white ones, and she described being labeled ethnically ambiguous, a term that sounds neutral, until you realize it often means we don't want to name what you are. That's the key way her story highlights the title's idea of heritage being softened or downplayed. It wasn't always a case of hiding. It was often a case of being filed under other, then cast in roles where race was left unspoken, so the character could be sold as universal. Meghan herself credited Suits for choosing her for Rachel Zane, without making her background the point, an opportunity that let her work, but also shows how quickly the industry can push identity into the margins when it thinks naming it might narrow the audience. If the industry keeps calling you ambiguous, is that freedom or a quiet way of erasing the parts it doesn't want to deal with? Heritage became impossible to ignore only after the world decided it mattered. When her relationship with Prince Harry became public and she later joined the royal family coverage, suddenly treated her background as a headline topic rather than a footnote, shifting from casting room uncertainty to global debates about race belonging and who fits in historically white institutions. And that's what makes Meghan's arc so revealing. The same system that once blurred identity for convenience can also spotlight it for controversy, proving that in public life, perception often controls the frame more than truth does. Zoe Saldana. Zoe Saldana's story doesn't fit the old Hollywood idea of a star denying heritage. It's more modern and in some ways more revealing. She's an Afro-Latina woman whose identity has often been reframed by other people's assumptions. Saldana was born in New Jersey to a Dominican father and a Puerto Rican mother, and she has spoken over the years about belonging to the African diaspora through her Caribbean roots. Yet Hollywood has a habit of treating identity like a casting shortcut. If the audience can't instantly categorize you, the industry sometimes chooses the easiest label or no label at all. That's why her biggest roles, Avatar, Guardians of the Galaxy, Star Trek, made her globally recognizable, while also making her racial background feel invisible to casual viewers. Those characters were built to travel internationally, and the marketing didn't need the public to think about her heritage. It needed the public to think about the franchise. The irony is that when your identity isn't foregrounded, people often decide you're neutral, and neutral in Hollywood has historically leaned closer to whiteness than it admits. When a performer's background isn't obvious to the audience, does Hollywood treat that as flexibility or as something to quietly smooth over? The Nina Simone biopic controversy exposed how quickly that smoothing becomes a cultural flashpoint. In 2016, when Saldana was cast as Simone in Nina Backlash, erupted over colorism, and the film's use of darkening makeup and prosthetics, critics argued, it reduced a dark-skinned icon's lived experience into surface transformation. Saldana initially defended taking the role, emphasizing that there is no one way to be black, while acknowledging the industry's limited opportunities for black women's stories. Then in 2020, Saldana publicly apologized and said Simone deserved better, adding that she should have used her platform differently and that the role should have gone to someone whose physical presence and life experience aligned more closely with Simone's. That arc defense reflection regret became a case study in how Hollywood can downplay heritage when convenient, then weaponize authenticity debates when a story involves a historic black figure whose identity is inseparable from how she was seen. Saldana's heritage was never the secret. The real tension is how often the industry and audiences act like identity only counts when it looks a certain way. Thandiwe Newton. Thandiwe Newton's story shows a quieter kind of heritage, hiding not a single dramatic denial, but a long series of small edits made by an industry that prefers identity to be simple, branded, and easy to sell. She was born Melanie Thandiwe Newton in London, Westminster in 1972 to a Zimbabwean mother from a Shona chieftaincy family and an English father, a life rooted in Black African ancestry and British culture at the same time. Yet Hollywood rarely marketed her with that full clarity. Early coverage often leaned on vague language, exotic, ambiguous other labels that can sound complimentary while quietly stripping away the truth of where someone comes from. The most symbolic example is also the simplest: her name. For decades, she worked under Thandi because the W in Thandiwe was dropped in her early screen credits, an error she later described as careless, but one she felt pressured to accept in a system that rewards convenience over accuracy. In 2021, she publicly reclaimed the correct spelling. "I'm taking back what's mine," turning a small typo into a larger statement about ownership of identity. If Hollywood can rewrite your name with one missing letter, how easily can it rewrite the rest of you? Newton has also described the darker side of this packaging. How early in her career she faced racism and sexual exploitation, including being asked to adjust her appearance. "Can you be a bit darker?" and later speaking publicly about abuse, she says happened when she was still a teenager entering the business. The industry doesn't always demand that a person hide heritage directly. Sometimes it pressures them to bend, tone down, blur, rename, reframe until they fit what the market will accept. Over time, Newton pushed back more openly, connecting her public self to her African roots and reclaiming the parts that had been smoothed over for years. Her story lands with weight because it isn't just about race in theory. It's about how identity can be quietly negotiated in credits, casting rooms, press narratives, and the everyday compromises that audiences never see. Paula Patton. Paula Patton's Hollywood story is less about a dramatic secret and more about how easily heritage can be muted by perception. She was born in Los Angeles to a black father, Charles Patton, and a white mother, Joyce Van Rodden, a straightforward fact, yet one that many casual viewers never attach to her when they see her on screen. In big studio films, her characters are often written without cultural framing, and that absence quietly teaches audiences to read her as neutral, even when her background isn't. What makes Paula stand out in this conversation is that she hasn't tried to dodge the topic, she's pushed back against the labels themselves. In a 2021 interview tied to her BET series Sacrifice, Patton said she does not identify as biracial, and the piece references her earlier view that the term can be used as a separator from African Americans. Paula's point was that she identifies as black. That matters because Hollywood frequently markets mixed heritage performers in a way that keeps race soft, especially when executives believe ambiguity travels better across audiences. If the public keeps reading someone's identity wrong, is that still visibility or a quieter kind of erasure? Her career shows how this plays out. In mainstream action and thriller projects, she's often positioned as the polished lead or love interest, where race is simply not part of the pitch, so the audience consumes the performance without ever being invited to see her lineage. The result is a strange split. Paula's heritage is real and documented, yet the industry's framing can make it feel optional, something a viewer discovers later rather than something the narrative acknowledges up front. Paula's story also highlights a pressure that doesn't always get named. When you don't fit a single stereotyped visual box, people decide your identity for you, sometimes flattening you into exotic, ambiguous, or just pretty without the history attached. Her insistence on defining herself, on rejecting a label she feels is loaded, becomes the point. Not because she's hiding anything, but because she's refusing to let the industry's convenient categories speak louder than her own truth. Eartha Kitt. Eartha Kitt is a powerful reminder that Hollywood doesn't always erase heritage by force. Sometimes it repackages it into something safer to sell. Kitt was born Eartha Mae Keith in South Carolina in 1927, and standard biographies describe her mother as having African and Cherokee ancestry, while details about her father remained uncertain for much of her life. From the beginning, her identity was treated like a problem other people wanted to control, too. Black for some rooms, too different to be allowed a simple, unprotected childhood, then later marketed as worldly and exotic, when that sounded more profitable than saying the word black. By the time she became widely known to TV audiences as Catwoman on Batman in 1967, Kitt had already mastered a difficult balancing act. She could sing in multiple languages, move like a dancer trained for international stages, and project sophistication that made gatekeepers comfortable. Yet that same polish sometimes became a convenient mask press. Narratives could spotlight glamour while softening the American reality underneath it, a black woman from the segregated South who never forgot what power looks like when it decides who belongs. When the industry calls someone exotic, is it celebrating culture or avoiding the truth of where they come from? That question matters because Kitt refused to stay packaged. The clearest turning point came at a White House Women Doers luncheon hosted by First Lady Lady Bird Johnson in January 1968, where Kitt criticized the Vietnam War and connected it to the pain affecting young Americans. Multiple credible accounts described the backlash as swift and severe U.S. bookings and invitations dried up, and she spent years working more abroad than at home, not because her talent vanished, but because her honesty made powerful people uncomfortable. So Eartha Kitt's story isn't about denying black identity. It's about an industry that preferred her as a stylish symbol until she spoke like a citizen. And that's the lasting punch. Her heritage was always there, but Hollywood often found it easier to applaud the mystique than to confront the full woman behind it. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't hide being Black America, could see that the moment he stepped under a spotlight. What Hollywood did do was pressure him to perform blackness in a way that felt safe to the mainstream tuxedos, impeccable manners, dazzling versatility, and a smile sharp enough to cut through hostility. He became a symbol of polish because polish was the price of entry. Offstage, the contradiction was brutal. In segregated Las Vegas, Davis later recalled that for the minutes he was on stage, our skin had no color. But the second he stepped off, he was colored again. While white acts could drink, gamble, and lounge, he said, black performers had to leave through the kitchen with the garbage. That single image explains the downplayed heritage theme better than any rumor. The industry wanted the performance, not the full person. Clubs and studios could celebrate him as entertainment while quietly restricting his access as a black man. Nevada history coverage and encyclopedic summaries describe how black headliners could pack strip showrooms, yet still be barred from hotel amenities and guest rooms forced to find lodging elsewhere. Even when he was one of the most famous faces on the marquee, the system treated his identity as something to be managed, made palatable, then contained. When the world applauds you on stage but limits you off stage, what kind of success is that really? And Davis didn't simply endure it, he pushed back. The Stanford King Institute documents his involvement with civil rights events, including performances connected to Dr. King's organizing, and notes that King thanked him in a 1961 letter while pointing to the growing role of black artists in the movement. That activism mattered because it challenged the same acceptable framing Hollywood preferred. Davis wasn't only a glamorous entertainer, he was a black man with public influence aligning with the fight for equality. His heritage was never a secret, but it was often edited in emphasis, smoothed into sophistication so white audiences could celebrate him without confronting the segregation that still surrounded him. He broke barriers while standing on top of them, and the emotional cost was that he had to be extraordinary just to be treated as ordinary for 5 minutes at a time. Logan Browning. Logan Browning's Hollywood story isn't about a star hiding in the classic old studio sense. It's about what happens when the industry and the audience keep misreading you until your heritage becomes a footnote instead of a fact. Browning has said she spent her entire life being hit with the same blunt question, "What are you?" as if identity is something you owe strangers on demand. The reason that question followed her is complicated, and she's been unusually direct about it in interviews. Browning has explained that she was adopted, raised by black parents, and that her biological mother is white, while her biological father is black, adding that she has never met her birth parents. That single set of facts is enough to show how quickly Hollywood's quick-glance culture can flatten a person into the wrong category, especially when lighter features become a shortcut for assumptions. When the public decides what you are before you speak is that visibility or a quieter kind of erasure, Browning's career then becomes a case study in how heritage gets downplayed without anyone explicitly saying hide it. She's described the way casting and perception can steer certain actors into racially neutral lanes roles where identity is treated as irrelevant because it's easier to market broadly. That tension exploded into focus when she starred as Samantha White on Netflix's Dear White People, a character whose biracial identity and campus politics force everyone around her to reveal their biases. In interviews around the series, Browning has talked about colorism and the pressure of being seen as ambiguous, not just by audiences, but by an industry that sometimes rewards proximity to palatable standards while still questioning whether you belong anywhere at all. What makes her segment gripping is that the hiding often isn't something she chose. It's something that happens when other people's assumptions become the default storyline. Even now, Browning's own words keep pulling the conversation back to reality. Light eyes don't rewrite upbringing, and public perception doesn't outrank lived experience. Her chapter fits your theme because it shows a modern version of what Hollywood has always done. Sometimes it doesn't erase heritage outright. It simply lets the world overlook it until the audience is trained not to ask. Boris Kodjoe. Boris Kodjoe's heritage has never been a secret on paper yet. In Hollywood, it has often been translated into something easier to market. Born March 8, 1973 in Vienna, Austria, he was raised between cultures, a German mother and a Ghanaian father, with early life split across Austria and Germany before he ultimately built his career in the United States. That background is rich and specific, but the industry's framing has frequently been broad and vague international, cosmopolitan, exotic labels that sound glamorous, while quietly skipping the deeper story of African roots and lived black identity. Kodjoe's own biography makes the pattern easy to see. He grew up speaking German, later mastering English and French, and his early public narrative leaned heavily on polished, multilingual, refined, globally acceptable. Even his breakthrough acting lane reinforced that packaging. In projects like Love and Basketball, and later roles across network dramas, he was often positioned as the smooth professional, the romantic lead, the elegant authority figure, parts designed to travel across audiences without demanding that viewers confront cultural specificity. When Hollywood calls someone international instead of naming their African heritage, is that celebration or a softer form of erasure? That question sits at the center of why his story belongs in this episode. Kodjoe's background is unmistakably connected to the African diaspora, yet Hollywood often treats that complexity as optional, something the audience can discover later, rather than something the camera must acknowledge now. His own life history shows how early success can come through universal framing, a tennis scholarship to Virginia Commonwealth University, a pivot into modeling after injury, and then acting, each step moving him deeper into an industry that rewards smoothness and simplification. What makes the downplayed heritage theme even sharper is that Kodjoe has spoken about cultural diversity and anti-racism work as part of his public identity, meaning his roots aren't something he treats casually. Encyclopedia profiles have noted his commitment to addressing racism and educating young people about cultural diversity, describing it as a direct extension of being raised across cultures. And that's the tension a man shaped by Ghana and Germany, by Europe and Africa, often reduced on screen to a sleek silhouette with an accentless, marketable identity. Boris Kodjoe's story shows how modern Hollywood doesn't always demand outright hiding. Sometimes it simply encourages a version of you that's easier to sell, while the fuller truth waits in the margins for viewers who look closer. Wentworth Miller. Wentworth Miller became a global star because Prison Break sold him as intensity, discipline, and mystery, an everyman genius whose identity was meant to feel universal. Yet his background has never been simple, and that's exactly where the theme of heritage being overlooked or quietly downplayed shows up. Miller was born in Chipping Norton, Oxfordshire, England, in 1972, to American parents who were in the UK when his father studied at Oxford. In a 2003 interview, Miller stated plainly that his father is black and his mother is white, a sentence that should end the debate, but rarely does, because Hollywood often lets appearance do the talking first. Biographical summaries describe his father as having African American and Jamaican ancestry, along with European roots, and his mother as having a mix of European and Middle Eastern ancestry. That gap between documented heritage and public perception shaped how he was introduced. Early in his fame, Prison Break marketing didn't sell him through racial context the way it often does with visibly black actors. Instead, he was framed as sleek, cerebral, racially undefined, an approach that can broaden audience reach while quietly teaching viewers to treat identity as irrelevant. That's not a conspiracy. It's a pattern. When a performer doesn't fit a stereotype, the industry frequently chooses the path of least explanation, and the audience fills in the blank with whatever it assumes. When the camera keeps your heritage out of the frame, do you become universal or do you become invisible? Miller has spoken about how long it can take to fully process that kind of in-between positioning. In a 2017 conversation with Rebecca Walker, he described not digging deeply into his racial identity until college and framed it as part of the larger work of figuring out who am I beyond what other people project onto you. That's a key detail for your episode. His story isn't about a dramatic denial. It's about an industry and an audience that often reads race quickly and then rarely revisits the assumption. So Wentworth Miller's chapter lands with a modern sting. His heritage was never erased on paper, yet for many viewers it remained unrecognized for years because Hollywood didn't foreground it, and because racial ambiguity is frequently treated as marketable. The result is a familiar paradox. The world thinks it knows a face, but not the full story attached to it. Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey's voice was never ambiguous, but for years the way the industry framed who she was often was. Mariah was born to an interracial family. Her father, Alfred Roy Carey, is widely described as black with Afro-Venezuelan/African-American roots, and her mother, Patricia, is white and Irish-American. In her own telling, that background didn't feel like a cute fun fact. It shaped her childhood through real hostility, and it followed her into a business that sells image as aggressively as it sells music. When Mariah's career exploded in the early 1990s, her marketing wasn't built around being a black artist the way it often was for R&B singers. The emphasis was pop phenomenon, universal superstar, crossover language that can open doors but can also quietly push heritage to the side if executives believe race might narrow sales. Mariah has said that from the start, powerful corporate forces packaged her in ways that played down her racial identity, and she later described how that made her feel both visible and unseen at the same time. If the world loves your songs but avoids naming your identity, is that acceptance or a more polished kind of avoidance? In 2020 to 2021, Mariah began speaking more directly about what that neutral framing cost her. Interviews and coverage around her memoir, The Meaning of Mariah Carey, highlight how she wrestled with being labeled racially ambiguous, and how that label followed her even as she broke records and defined an era. She's described the strange pressure of being treated as not quite one thing or the other, while her black heritage remained central to her lived experience, even when it wasn't central to the brand being sold. That's why Mariah's chapter belongs in this episode, not because she invented a new backstory, but because the industry often found it easier to market her as everybody's pop angel than to deal honestly with the complexities of race perception and belonging. And when she finally told the story in her own words, it wasn't a reveal. It was a correction, putting heritage back into a narrative that had been streamlined for mass comfort. So here's the debate. When Hollywood downplays someone's roots, is the star hiding, or is the system doing the hiding for them? Some careers were shaped by outright passing, others by ethnic ambiguity, colorism, and casting that treated identity as optional. But if audiences only learn the full truth years later, what did that invisibility cost roles, respect, or selfhood? Tell me where you stand. Should entertainers be expected to clarify their heritage, or should the industry stop demanding a simpler story? Drop your take in the comments and subscribe to the Black Excellence List for more fact-first stories that go beyond the spotlight.